So, this is a re-recording, since when I originally did this live on Twitch, it did not fully go through. So, we'll do it again. This time, not live. Alright. 1. The expanded relative form of value. The value of a single commodity, the linen, for example, is now expressed in terms of numberless other elements of the world of commodities. Every other commodity now becomes a mirror of the linen's value. It is thus that, for the first time, this value shows itself in its true light as a congelation of undifferentiated human labor. For the labor that creates it now stands expressly revealed as labor that ranks equally with every other sort of human labor, no matter what its form, whether tailoring, plowing, mining, etc., and no matter, therefore, whether it is realized in coats, corn, iron, or gold. The linen, by virtue of the form of its value, now stands in a social relation, no longer with only one other kind of commodity, but with the whole world of commodities. As a commodity, it is a citizen of that world. At the same time, the interminable series of value equations implies that as regards the value of a commodity, it is a matter of indifference under what particular form or kind of use value it appears. In the first form, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat. It might, for aught that otherwise appears, be pure accident that these two commodities are exchangeable in definite quantities. In the second form, on the contrary, we perceive at once the background that determines and is essentially different from this accidental appearance. The value of the linen remains unaltered in magnitude, whether expressed in coats, coffee, or iron, or in numberless different commodities, the property of as many different owners. The accidental relation between two individual commodity owners disappears. It becomes plain that it is not the exchange of commodities which regulates the magnitude of their value, but, on the contrary, that it is the magnitude of their value which controls their exchange proportions. 2. Their particular equivalent form. Each commodity, such as coat, tea, corn, iron, etc., figures in the expression of value of the linen as an equivalent and consequently as a thing that is value. The bodily form of each of these commodities figures now as a particular equivalent form, one out of many. In the same way, the manifold concrete useful kinds of labor embodied in these different commodities rank now as so many different forms of the realization or manifestation of the undifferentiated human labor. 3. Defects of the total or expanded form of value. In the first place, the relative expression of value is incomplete because the series representing it is interminable. The chain of which each equation of value is a link is liable at any moment to be lengthened by each new kind of commodity that comes into existence and furnishes the material for a fresh expression of value. In the second place, it is a many-colored mosaic of disparate and independent expressions of value. And lastly, if, as must be the case, the relative value of each commodity in turn becomes expressed in this expanded form, we get for each of them a relative value form, different in every case, and consisting of an interminable series of expressions of value. The defects of the expanded relative value form are reflected in the corresponding equivalent form. Since the bodily form of each single commodity is one particular equivalent form amongst numberless others, we have on the whole nothing but fragmentary equivalent forms, each excluding the others. In the same way, also, the special, concrete, useful kind of labor embodies in each particular equivalent is presented only as a particular kind of labor, and therefore not as an exhaustive representative of human labor generally. The latter, indeed, gains adequate manifestation in the totality of its manifold particular concrete forms, but in that case, its expression in an infinite series is ever incomplete and deficient in unity. The expanded relative value form is, however, nothing but the sum of the elementary relative expressions or equations of the first kind, such as 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, 20 yards of linen equals 10 pounds of tea, etc. Each of these implies the corresponding inverted equation. 1 coat equals 20 yards of linen. 10 pounds of tea equals 20 yards of linen, etc. In fact, when a person exchanges his linen for many other commodities, and thus expresses its value in a series of other commodities, it necessarily follows that the various owners of the latter exchange them for the linen, and consequently express the value of their various commodities in one and the same third commodity, the linen. If then we reverse the series, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or 10 pounds of tea, etc. That is to say, if we give expression to the converse relation already implied in the series, we get C, the general form of value. 1 coat, or 10 pounds of tea, or 40 pounds of coffee, or 1/4 of corn, or 2 ounces of gold, or half a ton of iron, equals 20 yards of linen. One, the altered character of the form of value. All commodities now express their value, 1, in an elementary form, because in a single commodity, 2, with unity because in one and the same commodity. This form of value is elementary and the same for all, therefore general. The forms A and B were fit only to express the value of a commodity as something distinct from its use value or material form. The first form, A, furnishes such equations as the following. 1 coat equals 20 yards of linen, 10 pounds of tea equals half a ton of iron. The value of the coat is equated to linen, that of the tea to iron. But to be equated to linen and again to iron is to be as different as are linen and iron. This form, it is plain, occurs practically only in the first beginning, when the products of labor are converted into commodities by accidental and occasional exchanges. The second form, B, distinguishes in a more adequate manner than the first. The value of a commodity from its use value, for the value of the coat is there placed in contrast under all possible shapes with the bodily form of the coat. It is equated to linen, to iron, to tea, in short, to everything else, only not to itself, the coat. On the other hand, any general expression of value common to all is directly excluded. For in the equation of value of each commodity, all other commodities now appear only under the form of equivalence. The expanded form of value comes into actual existence for the first time so soon as a particular product of labor, such as cattle, is no longer exceptionally but habitually exchanged for various other commodities. The third and lastly developed form of express the values of the whole world of commodities in terms of a single commodity set apart for the purpose, namely the linen, and thus represents to us their values by means of their equality with linen. The value of every commodity is now, by being equated to linen, not only differentiated from its own use value, but from all other use values generally, and is, by that very fact, expressed as that which is common to all commodities. By this form, commodities are, for the first time, effectively brought into relation with one another as values, or made to appear as exchange values. The two earlier forms either express the value of each commodity in terms of a single commodity of a different kind, or in a series of many such commodities. In both cases, it is, so to say, the special business of each single commodity to find an expression for its value, and this it does without the help of the others. These others, with respect to the former, play the passive parts of equivalence. The general form of value C results from the joint action of the whole world of commodities, and from that alone. A commodity can acquire a general expression of its value only by all other commodities, simultaneously with it expressing their values in the same equivalent, and every new commodity must follow suit. It thus becomes evident that since the existence of commodities as values is purely social, this social existence can be expressed by the totality of their social relations alone, and consequently that the form of their value must be a socially recognized form. All commodities being equated to linen now appear not only as qualitatively equal as values generally, but also as values whose magnitudes are capable of comparison. By expressing the magnitudes of their values in one and the same material, the linen, those magnitudes are also compared with each other. For instance, 10 pounds of tea equals 20 yards of linen, and 40 pounds of coffee equals 20 yards of linen. Therefore, 10 pounds of tea equals 40 pounds of coffee. In other words, there is contained in 1 pound of coffee only 1/4 as much substance of value, labor, as is contained in 1 pound of tea. The general form of relative value, embracing the whole world of commodities, converts the single commodity that is excluded from the rest, and made to play the part of equivalent, here the linen, into the universal equivalent. The bodily form of the linen is now the form assumed in common by the values of all commodities. It therefore becomes directly exchangeable with all and every of them. The substance linen becomes the visible incarnation, the social chrysalis state of every kind of human labor. Weaving, which is the labor of certain private individuals producing a particular article, linen, acquires in consequence a social character, the character of equality with all other kinds of labor. The innumerable equations of which the general form of value is composed equate in turn the labor embodied in the linen to that embodied in every other commodity, and they thus convert weaving into the general form of manifestation of undifferentiated human labor. In this manner, the labor realized in the values of commodities is presented not only under its negative aspect, under which abstraction is made from every concrete form and useful property of actual work, but its own positive nature is made to reveal itself expressly. The general value form is the reduction of all kinds of actual labor to their common character of being human labor generally, of being the expenditure of human labor power. The general value form, which represents all products of labor as mere congealations of undifferentiated human labor, shows by its very structure that it is the social resume of the world of commodities. That form consequently makes it indisputably evident that in the world of commodities the character possessed by all labor of being human labor constitutes its specific social character. 2. The interdependent development of the relative form of value and of the equivalent form. The degree of development of the relative form of value corresponds to that of the equivalent form, but we must bear in mind that the development of the latter is only the expression and result of the development of the former. The primary or isolated relative form of value of one commodity converts some other commodity into an isolated equivalent. The expanded form of relative value, which is the expression of the value of one commodity in terms of all other commodities, endows those other commodities with the character of particular equivalents, differing in kind. And lastly, a particular kind of commodity acquires the character of universal equivalent because all other commodities make it the material in which they uniformly express their value. The antagonism between the relative form of value and the equivalent form, the two poles of the value form, is developed concurrently with that form itself. The first form, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, already contains this antagonism, without as yet fixing it. According as we read this equation forwards or backwards, the parts played by the linen in the coat are different. In the one case, the relative value of the linen is expressed in the coat. In the other case, the relative value of the coat is expressed in the linen. In this first form of value, therefore, it is difficult to grasp the polar contrast. Form B shows that only one single commodity at a time can completely expand its relative value, and that it acquires this expanded form only because, and in so far as, all other commodities are, with respect to it, equivalents. Here we cannot reverse the equation, as we can the equation 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, without altering its general character and converting it from the expanded form of value into the general form of value. Finally, the form C gives to the world of commodities a general social relative form of value, because, and in so far as, thereby all commodities, with the exception of one, are excluded from the equivalent form. A single commodity, the linen, appears therefore to have acquired the character of direct exchangeability with every other commodity because, and in so far as, this character is denied to every other commodity. The commodity that figures as universal equivalent is on the other hand excluded from the relative value form. If the linen or any other commodity serving as universal equivalent were, at the same time, to share in the relative form of value, it would have to serve as its own equivalent. We should then have 20 yards of linen equals 20 yards of linen. This tautology expresses neither value nor magnitude of value. In order to express the relative value of the universal equivalent, we must rather reverse the form C. This equivalent has no relative form of value in common with other commodities, but its value is relatively expressed by a never-ending series of other commodities. Thus, the expanded form of relative value, or form B, now shows itself as the specific form of relative value for the equivalent commodity. Three. Transition from the general form of value to the money form. The universal equivalent form is a form of value in general. It can, therefore, be assumed by any commodity. On the other hand, if a commodity be found to have assumed the universal equivalent form, form C, this is only because, and in so far as, it has been excluded from the rest of all other commodities as their equivalent, and that by their own act. And from the moment that this exclusion becomes finally restricted to one particular commodity, from that moment only, the general form of relative value of the world of commodities obtains real consistence and general social validity. The particular commodity with whose bodily form the equivalent form is thus socially identified now becomes the money commodity, or serves as money. It becomes the special social function of that commodity, and consequently its social monopoly, to play within the world of commodities the part of the universal equivalent. Amongst the commodities which in Form B figure as particular equivalents of linen, and in Form C express in common their relative values in linen, this foremost place has been attained by one in particular, namely gold. If then in Form C we replace the linen by gold, we get D, the money form. 20 yards of linen, or 1 coat, or 10 pounds of tea, or 40 pounds of coffee, or 1 quarter of corn, or 2 ounces of gold, or half a ton of iron equals 2 ounces of gold. In passing from Form A to Form B, and from the latter to Form C, the changes are fundamental. On the other hand, there is no difference between Form C and D, except that in the latter, gold has assumed the equivalent form in the place of linen. Gold is in Form D what linen was in Form C, the universal equivalent. The progress consists in this alone, that the character of direct and universal exchangeability, in other words, that the universal equivalent form, has now by social custom become finally identified with the substance gold. Gold is now money with reference to all other commodities, only because it was previously, with reference to them, a simple commodity. Like all other commodities, it was also capable of serving as an equivalent, either as simple equivalent in isolated exchanges, or as particular equivalent by the side of others. Gradually it began to serve, within varying limits, as universal equivalent. So soon as it monopolizes this position in the expression of value for the world of commodities, it becomes the money commodity. And then, and not till then, does Form D become distinct from Form C, and the general form of value become changed into the money form. The elementary expression of the relative value of a single commodity, such as linen in terms of the commodity, such as gold, that play the part of money, is the price form of that commodity. The price form of the linen is therefore 20 yards of linen equals 2 ounces of gold, or, if 2 ounces of gold when coined are 2 pounds, 20 yards of linen equals 2 pounds. The difficulty in forming a concept of the money form consists in clearly comprehending the universal equivalent form, and as a necessary corollary, the general form of value, Form C. The latter is deductible from Form B, the expanded form of value, the essential component element of which, we saw, is Form A, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or X commodity A equals Y commodity B. The simple commodity form is therefore the germ of the money form. 4. The fetishism of commodities and the secret thereof. A commodity appears at first sight a very trivial thing and easily understood. Its analysis shows that it is, in reality, a very queer thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties, so far as it is of value and use. There is nothing mysterious about it, whether we consider it from the point of view that by its properties it is capable of satisfying human wants, or from the point that those properties are the product of human labor. It is as clear as noonday that man, by his industry, changes the forms of the materials furnished by nature in such a way as to make them useful to him. The form of wood, for instance, is altered by making a table out of it. Yet, for all that, the table continues to be that common, everyday thing, wood. But so soon as it steps forth as a commodity, it is changed into something transcendent. It not only stands with its feet on the ground, but, in relation to all other commodities, it stands on its head, and evolves out of its wooden brain grotesque ideas, far more wonderful than table-turning ever was. The mystical character of commodities does not originate, therefore, in their use value. Just as little does it proceed from the nature of the determining factors of value. For, in the first place, however varied the useful kinds of labor or productive activities may be, it is a physiological fact that they are functions of the human organism, and that each such function, whatever may be its nature or form, is essentially the expenditure of human brain, nerves, muscles, etc. Secondly, with regard to that which forms the groundwork for the quantitative determination of value, namely, the duration of that expenditure, or the quantity of labor, it is quite clear that there is a palpable difference between its quantity and quality. In all states of society, the labor time that it costs to produce the means of subsistence must necessarily be an object of interest to mankind, though not of equal interest in different stages of development. And lastly, from the moment that men in any way work for one another, their labor assumes a social form. Whence then arises the enigmatical character of the product of labor so soon as it assumes the form of commodities? Clearly, from this form itself, the equality of all sorts of human labor is expressed objectively by their products, all being equally values. The measure of the expenditure of labor power by the duration of that expenditure takes the form of the quantity of value of the products of labor, and finally the mutual relations of the producers, within which the social character of their labor affirms itself, take the form of a social relation between the products. A commodity is therefore a mysterious thing, simply because in it the social character of men's labor appears to them as an objective character stamped upon the product of that labor, because the relation of the producers to the sum total of their own labor is presented to them as a social relation, existing not between themselves, but between the products of their labor. This is the reason why the products of labor become the commodities, social things whose qualities are at the same time perceptible and imperceptible by the senses. In the same way, the light from an object is perceived by us not as the subjective excitation of our optic nerve, but as the objective form of something outside the eye itself. But in the act of seeing, there is at all events an actual passage of light from one thing to another, from the external object to the eye. There is a physical relation between physical things, but it is different with commodities. There, the existence of the things, qua commodities, and the value relation between the products of labor, which stamps them as commodities, have absolutely no connection with their physical properties and with the material relations arising therefrom. There it is, a definite social relation between men that assumes, in their eyes, the fantastic form of a relation between things. In order, therefore, to find an analogy, we must have recourse to the mist-enveloped regions of the religious world. In that world, the productions of the human brain appear as independent beings endowed with life, and entering into relation both with one another and the human race. So it is in the world of commodities with the products of men's hands. This I call the fetishism which attaches itself to the products of labor so soon as they are produced as commodities, and which is therefore inseparable from the production of commodities. This fetishism of commodities has its origin, as the foregoing analysis has already shown, in the peculiar social character of the labor that produces them. As a general rule, articles of utility become commodities only because they are products of the labor of private individuals or groups of individuals who carry on their work independently of each other. The sum total of the labor of all these private individuals forms the aggregate labor of society. Since the producers do not come into social contact with each other until they exchange their products, the specific social character of each producer's labor does not show itself except in the act of exchange. In other words, the labor of the individual asserts itself as a part of the labor of society only by means of the relations which the act of exchange establishes directly between the products, and indirectly through them between the producers. To the latter, therefore, the relations connecting the labor of one individual with that of the rest appear not as direct social relations between individuals at work, but as what they really are, material relations between persons and social relations between things. It is only by being exchanged that the products of labor acquire as values one uniform social status, distinction from their varied forms of existence as objects of utility. This division of a product into a useful thing and a value becomes practically important only when exchange has acquired such an extension that useful articles are produced for the purpose of being exchanged, and their character as values has therefore to be taken into account beforehand during production. From this moment, the labor of the individual producer acquires socially a twofold character. On the one hand, it must, as a definite useful kind of labor, satisfy a definite social want, and thus hold its place as part and parcel of the collective labor of all, as a branch of a social division of labor that has sprung up spontaneously. On the other hand, it can satisfy the manifold wants of the individual producer himself, only in so far as the mutual exchangeability of all kinds of useful private labor is an established social fact, and therefore the private useful labor of each producer ranks on equality with that of all others. The equalization of the most different kinds of labor can be the result only of an abstraction from their inequalities, or of reducing them to their common denominator vis-a-vis expenditure of human labor power or human labor in the abstract. The twofold social character of the labor of the individual appears to him, when reflected in his brain, only under those forms which are impressed upon that labor in everyday practice by the exchange of products. In this way, the character that his own labor possesses of being socially useful takes the form of the condition that the product must be not only useful, but useful for others, and the social character that his particular labor has of being the equal of all other particular kinds of labor takes the form that all the physically different articles that are the products of labor have one common quality, vis-a-vis that of having value. Hence, when we bring the products of our labor into relation with each other as values, it is not because we see in these articles the material receptacles of homogeneous human labor. Quite the contrary. Whenever by an exchange we equate as values our different products, by that very act we also equate as human labor the different kinds of labor expended upon them. We are not aware of this, nevertheless we do it. Value, therefore, does not stalk about with a label describing what it is. It is value, rather, that converts every product into a social hieroglyphic. Later on, we try to decipher the hieroglyphic, to get behind the secret of our own social products. For to stamp an object of utility as of value is just as much a social product as language. The recent scientific discovery that the products of labor, so far as they are values, are but material expressions of the human labor spent in their production, marks indeed an epoch in the history of the development of the human race, but by no means dissipates the mist through which the social character of labor appears to us to be an objective character of the products themselves. The fact that in the particular form of production with which we are dealing, vis-a-vis the production of commodities, the specific social character of private labor, carried on independently, consists in the equality of every kind of that labor, by virtue of its being human labor, which character, therefore, assumes in the product the form of value. This fact appears to the producers, notwithstanding the discovery above referred to be just as real and final as the fact that, after the discovery by science of the component gases of air, the atmosphere itself remained unaltered. What, first of all, practically concerns producers when they make an exchange is the question, how much of some other product they get for their own, and what proportions the product are exchangeable. When these proportions have by custom attained a certain stability, they appear to result from the nature of the products, so that, for instance, 1 ton of iron and 2 ounces of gold appear as naturally to be of equal value as a pound of gold and a pound of iron, in spite of their different physical and chemical qualities, appear to be of equal weight. The character of having value, when once impressed upon products, obtains fixity only by reason of their acting and reacting upon each other as quantities of value. These quantities vary continually, independently of the will, foresight, and action of the producers. To them, their own social actions takes the form of the action of objects, which rule the producers instead of being ruled by them. It requires a fully developed production of commodities before, from accumulated experience alone, the scientific conviction springs up that all the different kinds of private labor, which are carried on independently of each other, and yet as spontaneously developed branches of the social division of labor, are continually being reduced to the quantitative proportions in which society requires them. And why? Because in the midst of all the accidental and ever-fluctuating exchange relations between the products, the labor time socially necessary for their production forcibly asserts itself like an overriding law of nature. The law of gravity thus asserts itself when a house falls about our ears. The determination of the magnitude of value by labor time is therefore a secret, hidden under the apparent fluctuations in the relative values of commodities. Its discovery, while removing all appearance of mere accidentality from the determination of the magnitude of the values of products, yet in no way alters the mode in which that determination takes place. Man's reflection on the forms of social life, and consequently all his scientific analysis of those forms, take a course directly opposite to that of their actual historical development. He begins, post festum, with the results of the process of development ready to hand before him. The characters that stamp products as commodities, and whose establishment is a necessary preliminary to the circulation of commodities, have already acquired the stability of natural, self-understood forms of social life, before man seeks to decipher not their historical character, for in his eyes they are immutable, but their meaning. Consequently, it was the analysis of the prices of commodities that alone led to the determination of the magnitude of value, and it was the common expression of all commodities in money that alone led to the establishment of their characters as values. It is, however, just this ultimate money form of the world of commodities that actually conceals, instead of disclosing, the social character of private labor. In the social relations between the individual producers, when I state that coats or boots stand in relation to linen, because it is the universal incarnation of abstract human labor, the absurdity of the statement is self-evident. Nevertheless, when the producers of coats and boots compare those articles with linen, or, what is the same thing, with gold or silver, as the universal equivalent, they express the relation between their own private labor and the collective labor of society in the same absurd form. The categories of bourgeois economy consist of such like forms. They are forms of thought expressing with social validity the conditions and relations of a definite, historically determined mode of production, vis-a-vis the production of commodities. The whole mystery of commodities, all the magic and necromancy that surrounds the products of labor, as long as they take the form of commodities, vanishes therefore so soon as we come to other forms of production. Since Robinson Crusoe's experiences are a favorite theme with political economists, let us take a look at him on his island. Moderate though he be, yet some few wants he has to satisfy, and must therefore do a little useful work of various sorts, such as making tools and furniture, taming goats, fishing and hunting. Of his prayers and the like we take no account, since they are a source of pleasure to him, and he looks upon them as so much recreation. In spite of the variety of his work, he knows that his labor, whatever its form, is but the activity of one and the same Robinson, and consequently that it consists of nothing but different modes of human labor. Necessity itself compels him to apportion his time accurately between his different kinds of work. Whether one kind occupies a greater space in his general activity than another depends on the difficulties, greater or less, as the case may be, to be overcome in attaining the useful effect aimed at. This our friend Robinson soon learns by experience, and having rescued a watch, ledger, and pen and ink from the wreck, commences, like a true-born Briton, to keep a set of books. His stock-book contains a list of the objects of utility that belong to him, of the operations necessary for their production, and lastly, of the labor time that definite quantities of those objects have, on an average, cost him. All the relations between Robinson and the objects that form this wealth of his own creation are here so simple and clear as to be intelligible without exertion even to Mr. Sedley Taylor. And yet those relations contain all that is essential to the determination of value. Let us now transport ourselves from Robinson's Island, bathed in light, to the European Middle Ages, shrouded in darkness. Here, instead of the independent man, we find every one dependent, serfs and lords, vassals and suzerains, laymen and clergy. Personal dependence here characterizes the social relations of production, just as much as it does the other spheres of life, organized on the basis of that production. But for the very reason that personal dependence forms the groundwork of society, there is no necessity for labor and its products to assume a fantastic form different from their reality. They take the shape, in the transactions of society, of services in kind and payments in kind. Here, the particular and natural form of labor, and not, as in a society based on production of commodities, its general abstract form is the immediate social form of labor. Compulsory labor is just as properly measured by time as commodity-producing labor. But every serf knows that what he expends in the service of his lord is a definite quantity of his own personal labor power. The tithe to be rendered to the priest is more matter of fact than his blessing. No matter, then, what we may think of the parts played by the different classes of people themselves in this society, the social relations between individuals in the performance of their labor appears at all events as their own mutual personal relations, and are not disguised under the shape of social relations between the products of labor. For an example of labor in common or directly associated labor, we have no occasion to go back to that spontaneously developed form which we find on the threshold of the history of all civilized races. We have one close at hand in the patriarchal industries of a peasant family that produces corn, cattle, yarn, linen, and clothing for home use. These different articles are, as regards the family, so many products of its labor, but as between themselves, they are not commodities. The different kinds of labor, such as tillage, cattle tending, spinning, weaving, and making clothes, which result in the various products, are in themselves, and such as they are, direct social functions, because functions of the family, which, just as much as society based on the production of commodities, possesses a spontaneously developed system of division of labor. The distribution of the work within the family and the regulation of the labor time of the several members depend as well upon differences differences of age and sex as upon natural conditions varying with the seasons. The labor power of each individual, by its very nature, operates in this case merely as a definite portion of the whole labor power of the family, and therefore the measure of the expenditure of individual labor power by its duration appears here, by its very nature, as a social character of their labor. Let us now picture to ourselves, by way of change, a community of free individuals carrying on their work with the means of production in common, in which the labor power of all the different individuals is consciously applied as the combined labor power of the community. All the characteristics of Robinson's labor are here repeated, but with this difference, that they are social instead of individual. Everything produced by him was exclusively the result of his own personal labor, and therefore simply an object of use for himself. The total product of our community is a social product. One portion serves as fresh means of production and remains social, but another portion is consumed by the members as means of subsistence. A distribution of this portion amongst them is consequently necessary. The mode of this distribution will vary with the productive organization of the community and the degree of historical labor, of historical development attained by the producers. We will assume, but merely for the sake of a parallel with the production of commodities, that the share of each individual producer in the means of subsistence is determined by his labor time. Labor time would, in that case, play a double part. Its apportionment, in accordance with a definite social plan, maintains the proper proportion between the different kinds of work to be done in the various wants of the community. On the other hand, it also serves as a measure of the portion of the common labor borne by each individual, and of his share in the part of the total product destined for individual consumption. The social relations of the individual producers, with regard both to their labor and to its products, are in this case perfectly simple and intelligible, and that with regard not only to production but also to distribution. The religious world is but the reflex of the real world, and for a society based upon the production of commodities, in which the producers in general enter into social relations with one another by treating their products as commodities and values, whereby they reduce their individual private labor to the standard of homogeneous human labor, for such a society, Christianity, with its cultus of abstract man, more especially in its bourgeois developments, Protestantism, deism, etc., is the most fitting form of religion. In the ancient Asiatic and other ancient modes of production, we find that the conversion of products into commodities, and therefore the conversion of men into producers of commodities, holds a subordinate place, which, however, increases in importance as the primitive communities approach nearer and nearer to their dissolution. Trading nations, properly so called, exist in the ancient world only in its interstices, like the gods of Epicurus in the Intermundia, or like Jews in the pores of Polish society. Those ancient social organisms of production are, as compared with bourgeois society, extremely simple and transparent. But they are founded either on the immature development of man individually, who has not yet severed the umbilical cord that unites him with his fellow men in a primitive tribal community, or upon direct relations of subjection. They can arise and exist only when the development of the productive power of labor has not risen beyond a low stage, and when, therefore, the social relations within the sphere of material life between man and between man and nature are correspondingly narrow. This narrowness is reflected in the ancient worship of nature and in the other elements of the popular religions. The religious reflex of the real world can, in any case, only then finally vanish when the practical relations of everyday life offer to man none but perfectly intelligible and reasonable relations with regard to his fellow men and to nature. The life process of society, which is based on the process of material production, does not strip off its mystical veil until it is treated as production by freely associated men, and is consciously regulated by them in accordance with a settled plan. This, however, demands for society a certain material groundwork or set of conditions of existence, which in their turn are the spontaneous product of a long and painful process of development. Political economy has indeed analyzed, however incompletely, value and its magnitude, and has discovered what lies beneath these forms. But it has never once asked the question why labor is represented by the value of its product, and labor time by the magnitude of that value. These formulae, which bear it stamped upon them in unmistakable letters that they belong to a state of society in which the process of production has the mastery over man instead of being controlled by him. Such formulae appear to the bourgeois intellect to be as much a self-evident necessity imposed by nature as productive labor itself. Hence, forms of social production that preceded the bourgeois form are treated by the bourgeoisie in much the same way as the fathers of the church treated pre-Christian religions. To what extent some economists are misled by the fetishism inherent in commodities or by the objective appearance of the social characteristics of labor is shown, amongst other ways, by the dull and tedious quarrel over the part played by nature in the formation of exchange value. Since exchange value is a definite social manner of expressing the amount of labor bestowed upon an object, nature has no more to do with it than it has in fixing the course of exchange. The mode of production in which the product takes the form of a commodity or is produced directly for exchange is the most general and most embryonic form of bourgeois production. It therefore makes its appearance at an early date in history, though not in the same predominating and characteristic manner as nowadays. Hence, its fetish character is comparatively easy to be seen through. But when we come to more concrete forms, even this appearance of simplicity vanishes. Whence arose the illusions of the monetary system? To it, gold and silver, when serving as money, did not represent a social relation between producers, but were natural objects with strange social properties. And modern economy, which looks down with such disdain on the monetary system, does not its superstition come out as clear as noonday whenever it treats of capital? How long is it since economy discarded the physiocratic illusion that rents grow out of the soil and not out of society? But not to anticipate, we will content ourselves with yet another example relating to the commodity form. Could commodities themselves speak, they would say, our use value may be a thing that interests men. It is no part of us as objects. What, however, does belong to us as objects is our value. Our natural intercourse as commodities proves it. In the eyes of each other, we are nothing but exchange values. Now listen how these commodities speak through the mouth of the economist. Value, i.e. exchange value, is a property of things. Riches, i.e. use value, of man. Value, in this sense, necessarily implies exchanges. Riches do not. Riches, use value, are the attribute of men. Value is the attribute of commodities. A man or a community is rich. A pearl or a diamond is valuable. A pearl or a diamond is valuable as a pearl or a diamond. So far, no chemist has ever discovered exchange value either in a pearl or a diamond. The economist discoverers of this chemical element, who, by the by, lay special claim to critical acumen, find, however, that the use value of objects belongs to them independently of their material properties, while their value, on the other hand, forms a part of them as objects. What confirms them in this view is the peculiar circumstance that the use value of objects is realized without exchange, by means of a direct relation between the objects and man, while, on the other hand, their value is realized only by exchange, that is, by means of a social process. Who fails here to call to mind our good friend Dogberry, who informs neighbor Seacole that to be a well-favored man is the gift of fortune, but reading and writing comes by nature. And that is the end of today's reading. Hopefully, I won't have more re-recordings. So catch me live on Twitch if you're interested, if you see this and like this. Or I upload the videos afterwards so you can listen to me anytime. Thanks for hanging.